When you think about a cruise ship, what comes to mind? 6,000 passenger megaships with big restaurants, water slides, auto racetracks, over-the-top entertainment. It's sometimes easy to forget you're actually sailing at sea. But there's one cruise ship out there you've probably never heard of. It's called the Astoria. It's not the biggest ship on the water, and it has none of the flashy bells and whistles of the other ships. In a business where a 25-year-old cruise ship might be considered almost ready for the scrapyard, the Astoria has surpassed that retirement age by decades. It's a remarkable 72 years of age, and the Astoria is still sailing as the oldest operating cruise ship in the world. But it's not only her age that makes her special, it's her history. Because this is the same ship that sank a legend of the seas, the pride of the Italian fleet, the Andrea Doria, more than 60 years ago. And the people who remember that story don't call this ship the Astoria. They call it by her original name, the Stockholm. And they also remember the date it happened, July 25th, 1956. Heading eastbound, about 180 miles from New York, was the Stockholm. It was the beautiful flagship of the Swedish-American line. Launched in early 1948, this gleaming white ship was the first new passenger ship to sail across the Atlantic after World War II. It was the largest passenger ship ever built in Sweden, fitted with a strengthened steel icebreaker bow, but it was also the smallest liner crossing the North Atlantic. All seemed normal on that evening on the busy shipping lanes. One of the ships out there that night was the Andrea Doria. Named after a 16th century admiral considered the father of his country, the Doria was the crown jewel of the Italian fleet, and like the Titanic, was promoted as unsinkable. Built just 3 years earlier, this was truly a luxury ocean liner. Its design and style attracted the wealthy and the powerful. Hollywood celebrities like Cary Grant and Tyrone Power often booked passage. The Andrea Doria had left Genoa 8 days earlier and was nearing the end of her 51st regular transatlantic run to New York. A few hours earlier, the Stockholm had left her pier in Manhattan for the journey to Sweden. By 10:30 that night, passengers on the Doria were celebrating their farewell night aboard, and on the Stockholm, passengers were also in a festive mood, just beginning their journey. Heavy fog had rolled in as the two ships, heading in opposite directions, approached each other off the coast of Nantucket. While officers on each ship spotted the other vessel on their radars, they misinterpreted both distance and direction. And then suddenly, at 11:10 p.m., the ships, each steaming at speed, collided. The Stockholm's bow slammed into the Andrea Doria's starboard side at 18 knots and rammed 30 feet into its hull, ripping the Andrea Doria open from her upper deck down to below the waterline. And in that one instant, more than 40 people died from the collision, most still in their cabins. Inside stateroom 52 on the starboard side of the Andrea Doria, 14-year-old Linda Morgan was asleep in the outer berth with her 8-year-old half-sister Joan. Her mother and stepfather, a New York Times correspondent, were in stateroom 54. When the Stockholm sliced into the Andrea Doria, the bow came crashing into Linda's cabin, killing her half-sister instantly. In the next cabin, the bow pushed her mother and stepfather into stateroom 56, where her mother, now seriously injured, watched her husband die. But where was Linda? The Stockholm's bow had actually come under her berth, and in an instant, catapulted her up onto the deck of the Stockholm.
The next thing I remember is waking up, and I was completely outside. I was looking at the stars, which is funny because it was supposed to be very fun. At least that's what I remember. And I was on my mattress, but it had no sheets. I had my pajamas, and I couldn't figure out where I was.
The scene on board the Andrea Doria was frantic. The ship almost immediately listed at 18 degrees, then 20 degrees, and then 22 degrees. Its fate was sealed. Thousands of tons of water poured into the liner. The order to abandon ship was given, and an SOS was transmitted. Half the lifeboats were unusable because of the heavy list. Nearby ships came to help, and by 5:30 the next morning, the Andrea Doria had been abandoned. When the sun rose, the extensive damage to the Stockholm was shocking. Her deck had been accordioned, literally, and there was no bow left. It was then discovered that 5 crew members of the Stockholm, who had been in their forward cabins, had died instantly in the collision. But where was Linda Morgan? As one of the surviving crew members of the Stockholm came out on what was left of the forward deck, he suddenly heard the distant moaning of a young girl coming from where the bow used to be.
I started to yell for my mother in Spanish. And the interesting thing about that was that the only person on the Stockholm that knew Spanish was a sailor that came out because he couldn't figure out why there was anybody out there, because no passenger was allowed on that part of the ship. And so he came and picked me up. And just about the time that he did that, somebody came up with a manifest and asked me my name. And my name was not on the manifest.
Because you were not on that ship.
No. And so I said, is this the Andrea Doria? And they said, no.
When they found her, the crew of the Stockholm had no idea who she was. And lying next to her on the mangled deck was her small red autograph book, which had somehow survived the journey with her from the Andrea Doria. And the Stockholm, now carrying 572 Andrea Doria survivors, had already turned around, and at very slow speed began heading back to Manhattan, later passing the Statue of Liberty in the distance.
We're thinking for you about 500 feet over the Atlantic.
The disaster made history for another reason. It was the first television broadcast of an ocean liner sinking. The legendary CBS anchor Douglas Edwards and his producer Don Hewitt, who would later go on to launch and produce 60 Minutes, flew up to Boston that morning from New York, then chartered a small seaplane with their cameraman.
The Andrea Doria, pride of the Italian lines, looking like a colorful but big and dead hippopotamus.
And then, shortly after 10 that morning, with the seaplane flying overhead and the camera rolling, the Andrea Doria sank in 265 feet of water.
As we circle, the Andrea Doria seems to be slowly easing over. Our Navy skipper says she's going down in a very few minutes. Now the swimming pools are in the water. The ship is taking water fast. It's a 50% list now with the funnels down. Green foam looking for all the world like lifeblood of a great ship. A terrible sight to see. And down goes the Andrea Doria, the time 10:09 Eastern Daylight Time.
In all, 51 people died in the collision, and with more than 1,600 people saved by the flotilla of ships, including the French liner Ile-de-France, it became one of the largest civilian maritime rescues in history.
I had a broken arm, I had 2 broken legs, I'd obviously had a concussion, and I had both cracked hips.
Back in Manhattan, the Stockholm unloaded the survivors, including Linda Morgan.
There's definitely sort of residual, memories that having had a concussion, I don't do very well with rushing water into a small space. So that must have something to do with what I heard.
And Linda Morgan became known forever as the Miracle Girl. So what happened to the Stockholm? Was it broken up? Scrapped? No. 3 months later, with an investment of $1 million, that's in 1956 dollars, they rebuilt the bow. And here it is today, more than 53 years later. Think about it. The ship was originally built in Sweden, the bow was replaced in New Jersey, and the superstructure completely replaced in Italy. And yet the old-timers still affectionately call the ship the Stockholm. And then, just as quietly, it went back to sea. But that's not where the Stockholm story ends. It's where it continues. The Italians would forever call it the Ship of Death. After sailing with the Swedish-American line for a few more years, the Stockholm was then sold to a surprising buyer, the East German government, to be used as a cruise ship to reward loyal Communist Party members for their work. The ship was named the Volker Freundschaft. That means friendship between nations.
Lohnvorkommen stehen wir Ihnen als Wegweiser gerne zur Verfügung.
And then, for the next 25 years, she sailed under the East German flag. The ship still contained the Stockholm swimming pool, even the casino. And those families who were invited to sail on her could come with one strict condition. At least one family member had to stay back home to prevent the rest of the family from defecting at many of the ship's ports of call. In 1985, the East Germans then sold the rusting, nearly 40-year-old ship to a Panamanian company, and its new name was shortened to the Volker. Soon, the name changed again to the Fridtjof Nansen, and she was moved to Norway and used as housing for asylum seekers and refugees in Oslo. By 1994, she was moved to a shipyard in Italy, renamed the Sorrento, and rebuilt. And when she sailed again, it was as the Italia I. Then the name and the ownership changed again to the Italia Prima. Shortly thereafter, she was renamed the Walter Prima and sailed off into Cuba. In 2002, she was sold again and sailed as the Caribe. By 2005, she re-emerged as the Athena, registered in Portugal. Then the ship was flagged out of Cyprus. And in 2008, to add to her already colorful history, she was attacked by pirates in the Gulf of Aden. In 2013, she reappeared as the Azores. And finally, in 2016, perhaps her last name change to the Astoria. In all, about 12 different names, 9 different owners. No other ship can claim that kind of history. For the past few years, the ship has been cruising the British Isles in the summer and in the Sea of Cortez in Mexico in the winter, where I caught up with her. The Astoria has some enduring features you won't find on the newer, bigger ships, like a wide promenade deck that circles the entire ship. Now, the teak is old, it's worn, and there are even rust spots in some areas. But the passengers on this ship, they don't seem to mind.
You feel the vintage. It just has that old movie star look to it.
My husband is a big history buff, so that was a big deal to him to be on this.
It's just amazing that I was so glad we could come on it and be on this trip just because of the beauty of the ship and the uniqueness of it.
So you can actually see all the names.
Yeah.
From maritime historian Peter Canego, getting on board the Astoria was checking the box of his ultimate bucket list.
This ship has the best history of any ship afloat. I call this the most interesting ship in the world. Just the fact that there is a ship like this still in existence is a great coup. In the past 20 years, all of the classic ships have been sold for scrap, and this is the only one that's left, and this is one of the most beautifully designed ships afloat.
For Canego and many other passengers, it's reliving that history and also doing the math.
The oldest part of the ship is 3 times as old as the newest part of the ship, which is now considered a classic ship. In certain ways, it doesn't surprise me that this ship is still sailing, because the construction of that hull is better than anything they could build today.
And today, the Astoria really hasn't changed that much. Much of the Art Deco feel remains. The cabins, as small and Spartan as the 1950s, many with the original portholes. The pool, small, almost ornamental. The dining room, frozen in time. Even the dinner plates still carry the logo of the last name of the ship, the Azores. The aging kitchen, tired, but somehow churning out meals. A trip to the engine room reveals a mechanical time capsule, a well-worn complete throwback, surrounded and driven by old-school technology, but somehow all still functions. The casino, just a few 5-cent slot machines, one blackjack table, and the employees, one. The dealer, he's also the cashier. The chapel is still on board. And on display, if you can find it, the original bell from the Stockholm.
I don't care where the ship goes, I'm happy to be on it, and I think a lot of passengers would agree with me.
And the entertainment? Well, the dance music may not be a waltz or a foxtrot anymore, but for the moment, passengers are still taking to the floor.
She's almost like Cher. She just never stops performing. She's going to go on that stage and do the endless tour until the end finally does come.
But there's one person who won't be sailing on this ship anytime soon. The one person who was never supposed to be on it in the first place. Today, Linda Morgan lives in San Antonio, Texas, far removed from ocean liners and cruise ships. And that's the way she wants it. So, no more cruise ships for you?
No, not a fan.
Her only physical memory from the Andrea Doria, that small red book and an autograph from the Andrea Doria's captain. And how long will this historic ship still sail? Its owners may get one more season out of her. In the end, the economics of modern cruising are no longer in the Astoria's favor, and her days may finally be numbered. But as just about anyone will tell you who's ever traveled on her, her memories sail on.